Good evening. Welcome to the program. I'm not going to take a long time here in introduction. I'll let Allie do most of the talking. But so my name is Dorothy Petrie, and I'm one of the co-presidents for Webster Central PTSA. And I thank you all for coming tonight. I ran into Allison. I actually met Allison for the first time when we were 12. And this spring, we were at the Susan B. Anthony birthday celebration, and Billie Jean King was there as the keynote speaker, which was awesome. And we started talking and hearing what she was doing at Resolve, and I said, you know what, we would love to have you come and speak in Webster. So I will hand the microphone off to you. Allison, thank you for coming.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Well, this is really my favorite topic to talk about, and this is a remarkable audience. There are so many parents who do not want to have this conversation, who don't want to worry about their kids being in safe and healthy relationships because they think it's only going to happen to somebody else's kid. I got into this work officially in 2008, but dating violence and domestic violence are my personal life story, and that's what drew me into this work. So I'll touch on pieces of that as illustration as we go through the presentation tonight, but I really want to applaud all of you for being here, because to keep our kids safe, it just takes being aware. It doesn't take being a superhero, it just takes being aware. So I'm going to try to keep it to an hour, and I would encourage you to ask questions as they come up. Don't hold them. It's a whole lot easier to have this dialogue interactively. Okay? So first, a little bit about Resolve. Resolve has existed, been serving the community doing domestic violence intervention work since 1998. We were originally known as an organization called Safe Journey. We merged with another group in 2012 called the Stand Up Guys, and together we're now called Resolve. So I'm going to take 2 seconds to tell you about Stand Up Guys. And first of all, every single one of you dads that's in this room is a Stand Up Guy. I'm so excited to see so many dads here. This is great. The idea behind Stand Up Guys is not to engage with men who are perpetrating violence, but to connect with good guys who are most guys and say, how do you become partners in this work? So just being here tonight, being present, understanding that you have a role to play in your sons and daughters' lives is huge, and I really want to thank you all for being here. So Stand Up Guys is really about men engaging together with men as allies in domestic and sexual violence. If I had known we were going to have so many men here tonight, I would have brought one of my male colleagues, because it's a little bit of a different conversation when it comes from a man. But I apologize. So our mission is to develop and deliver innovative community-centered solutions that empower people and communities to break the cycle of domestic violence. We tend to think of this as a private matter. Hopefully all of you saw my outhouse outside the door. October happens to be Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So those outhouses are circulating all over Rochester and Monroe County. They're on people's front yards, they're at businesses. And the idea is to just draw attention to a subject that we normally don't want to talk about, and to do it in a way that it's a little less frightening. It's not about making light of the issue, it's just making it more approachable. We provide intervention and prevention programs like tonight, and we have been, well, we are a 501c3, and we are entirely privately funded. We don't receive any state or federal money. I'll come back to the campaign if we have time at the end. So what we're going to talk tonight about is successful teen dating relationships. How many people are excited about their kids dating? Yeah, I'm not either. And I have an 8th grader. Some of you may have picked up the article that was in the back of the room that I wrote a couple years ago for Rochester Woman's Magazine. My son at the time was in 5th grade, and I had just gotten the dreaded puberty letter, came home. And I thought, oh my God, I'm just a couple years away from the reality that my kid is really going to grow up. He's going to be taller than me, which he is today. You know, he's going to stink. He's going to break out, right? I'm going to smell him when he's walking into the room. And he's going to be interested in dating. How is that possible? None of us are excited about the prospects of our children dating. Why do you think that is? Does anybody have any thoughts that they'd be willing to share about why this is kind of so anxiety producing? So for people who couldn't hear, she just said it's very different today than it was for all of us. That's a big one. I think that's a really great observation. Any other feelings about? Okay. The loss of control, the idea that you really can keep your kids safe, but when they're on a date, they're on their own. Any other? Yeah. And we'll talk a little bit about that. That's a great one. So she said our own failures. You know, most of us want to pray to God that the worst thing our kid is going to endure in the experience of dating is a broken heart, right? That's the best possible scenario. And for those of us who've had our heart broken, as most of us have at some point along the way, we know that that's not a great scenario, right? So even wanting to protect our kids from a broken heart is a natural parental response to the idea of dating. But when we think about our own heartbreak, when we think about how hard it was to make connections, to, you know, to have a terrible crush on somebody who doesn't really want to be with you, those are hard. It's hard to remember those times and to think that that's kind of the frontier that our children are embarking on. So in order for our kids to be successful, we really have to understand what our role is in our children's dating. So, you know, we've all heard the phrase helicopter parenting. The nature of dating takes us out of the picture a great deal. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what we can do, there are a lot of things that we can do as parents and that will help our kids to be really successful. And then we will actually look at what dating violence is so that you know what it is, so that you know what to look for, you know what to pay attention to. It's scary. I'm not going to tell you it's not scary. In fact, this whole conversation tonight, the sheer reality that acknowledging that our kids want to date or may very soon be interested in dating is an acknowledgement that our kids are sexual beings. Oh. You know, they are. And so understanding how to help them be safe and be caring and receive then, have an expectation that they receive that same care in return is important. So it's important that we start with this realization that every relationship, whether it's a friendship, a marriage, an intimate partnership, a dating relationship, exists on a continuum. Would you all agree with that? So we start, and really where we all hope the majority of our relationships are is in that healthy category. And so I put some very general ideas in that bucket of, you know, a healthy relationship, whether it's a friendship or a dating relationship or a marriage, based on mutual respect, a general spirit of cooperation, a dynamic of support between the parties, and an ability to navigate through conflict. Huge. What is conflict? A disagreement, right? Conflicts are actually communication. It's a form of communication. We are really conditioned as people to think about conflict as a negative. It's not always a negative. It's just two people that are on a different side of a point trying to figure out how to come to some common understanding or agreement. So it's just a form of communication. It doesn't have to be positive or negative, but we tend to assign that value to it. As teenagers, there's very clear idea of, like, if you don't agree with me, I have a big problem with you, right? Because clearly you have a problem with me. So there's a ton of energy in kids when they argue. And in those early dating relationships, an argument usually in the minds of most kids means that this relationship's going to end. right? They take on a degree of risk over just having a disagreement with someone that is not what a normal adult relationship would experience. So the intensity of that disagreement is really, really strong for our kids, and that's developmentally appropriate. It's part of the reason why they're interested in developing these relationships, because they get to take the training wheels off and kind of figure out, how do I negotiate when there's love involved, or what I think is love or affection is involved. That's a new dynamic for them. The other component about healthy relationships that's really, really important, and as your kids get older, you're going to hear this word more and more and more, is this notion of really understanding what consent is about. How any of you have older kids? Okay, high school, maybe even college-age kids. This is a conversation that's being had at a national level. It's a huge conversation on college campuses across the country. Most of you in this room are comparable in age to me. I'm probably older than a number of you, but you know, when we grew up, the idea of no means no was kind of governed the day, right? So you can go as far as you go until I say no. And that was considered consensual. If I didn't stop you, I was giving you consent to continue. So today's wisdom and the new way of thinking about this is no longer no means no, but yes means yes. For people that are old like me, it's kind of confusing to think about. But here's the big difference between no means no and yes means yes. Yes means yes is about both parties involved in whatever they're involved in having responsibility for themselves and for the other person. So this is a conversation around sexual assault that happens all the time. So the notion that my body is my body, I get to decide what happens to it and when, and your body is your body, and you have that same control. So healthy relationships, even from the very beginning, are about understanding your responsibility to yourself and your responsibility to your partner. Does that make sense? Any questions? Yeah. So that's what we're trying to change. The question was, how often do you find people taking that responsibility seriously? And that is exactly the dynamic that needs to change. And if we begin to set an expectation at this level, at junior high, because let me tell you, when I'm up talking and working with college students, it's too late. It's too late to start there. They have the capacity to understand things intellectually a little bit better, but they already have bad skills, right? We already have to unlearn by the time they're in college. What we want to do at this age is teach that notion of, I am always responsible for me, and you are always responsible for you. And when we are together, we're sharing responsibility for each other, and we're respecting each other's limits. Limits and boundaries are a huge, huge issue in these early dating relationships, and that's part of what it's about developmentally, is figuring out what is a healthy and safe boundary for you, and when are you going to allow yourself to stretch a little bit outside of that boundary, and are you doing it because you're choosing to do it, or are you doing it because you feel coerced or forced to do it? Or you're not going to feel loved or appreciated if you don't stretch outside of what feels right to you. So that's really important for parents to understand, and it means we have to have some awkward conversations with our kids. We need to talk about things like tuning in to your own intuition, paying attention to what you know feels okay and what doesn't feel okay, and learning to raise your voice. That's the other big part of consent that's important, is that, and I hate to even bring the law into it, but it becomes an issue later on. But from a legal definition of consent, there has to be verbal consent. You can't just read body cues. Okay, so why do you think that's an issue, and why do you think that's important for like a middle school age kid? Yeah, their brains are underdeveloped for sure. They're very, very literal, and so, yeah, they don't have the communication skills yet, and they're experiencing things in their bodies that they don't understand, right? That's what this whole puberty experience is about. Like, they have urges and things that they just really don't understand. And boy, something feels really good that maybe I haven't done before, and then all of a sudden it doesn't feel good. So what do I do about that? You know, is it okay for me now to just stop and tell you to stop? And the answer to that is always, unequivocally, yes. But everything they are conditioned to, our culture, the media, if we're not having conversations with our kids that say, trust yourself and trust your limits, every other influence they have out there is going to say, you know, you're such and such if you don't do this, right? And it's a double bind for girls, because a girl that may decide that she's ready to go a little further than she was the last time runs the risk of being a slut, runs the risk of being shamed by her friends if she then tells them what she did. She gets a reputation with the boys. The boys like her, but they don't really like her. They just like her because of what they know she'll do. Right? So this is hard stuff, and it's hard for adults to manage it, let alone for teenagers who, and preteens even, who are thinking about, I just know what I feel right now. Like, I can't give you words. I don't have those words yet. So then we get into moving ahead now into unhealthy relationships. I would venture to guess that there isn't a single person in this room who at some point in their life hasn't had an unhealthy relationship. We've all at least had one friend who wasn't really a friend. We've learned through experience what a difficult friendship can feel like. Well, then when we get into dating relationships, you know, unhealthy relationships are basically characterized by, you know, frequent disagreements. We really don't have a whole lot in common, and so there's a whole lot of push and pull all the time. And the only thing that might be in common is the attraction. And then other than that, there's not a whole lot there, okay? There's the lack of trust piece, which often looks like jealousy. Kids can't tell the difference. A lot of adults can't tell the difference. There is healthy jealousy, like we've just started going out and I feel jealous because I saw you talking to Sam over there. But being able to say that I feel jealous instead of behaving in a jealous way or creating consequences because I feel jealous, that's unhealthy, okay? And lack of respect. And lack of respect leads to lack of consent. So unhealthy relationships, this is really just, it's normal to have an unhealthy relationship. It's not potentially dangerous to be in an unhealthy relationship, but your young person is going to feel just like they're trying and nothing's working. So thinking about that dynamic of an unhealthy relationship and helping your student or young person, child, think about, you know, in general, when you're with this person, do you feel good about yourself? You know, those kinds of questions can be helpful questions. Or acknowledging things that you see or naming things that you see. Like, you know, when I saw you with so-and-so the other day, you know, you seemed upset. You seemed unhappy. You seemed like you were really trying to please. You know, what was that about? How's that relationship going? How does it feel? And helping kids have a space. They may not tell you. That's okay. But the fact that you opened the door is really important. Then we get into the abusive relationships. And these are the ones, this is really where you have to start paying attention. And sometimes the distinction between unhealthy and abusive is hard to see. But in an abusive relationship, there is an inherent control dynamic. And that's what you as adults may be able to pick up on that your student or your young person may not be able to pick up on. So when I say that, controlling behavior, you see efforts to manipulate them. You see or you gather that there's some put downs or name calling, or your child isn't feeling valued and appreciated by this other person. The other person gets to call the shots all the time. That's controlling behavior. They may be dictating what your child can or cannot wear, who they can or cannot hang out with, what activities they can be involved in. So when we see kids who are in these relationships, and they don't start this way. You know, even as kids, the first time you're interested in somebody, if they don't reciprocate that interest, you're not hanging around, right? You know better, even as a kid. But sorry, I lost my train of thought. Over time, the control kind of presents itself as like a constant negotiation or a bargaining. Like, but I really want to be with you, and if you do the yearbook, we can't be together. So I really want to be with you, which may feel really good to your young person for a while. But then it gets really tiring because they're constantly being put in a position to have to choose between their boyfriend or girlfriend and other things that they enjoy doing. So that's that dynamic of control at work, one example of how that plays out. And then, of course, then there's the violent relationships, which is everybody's greatest fear. We're going to talk a bit more about this later, but that's obviously where things get physical, where there's some sexual abuse. And really, of the three things I've listed here, the one that can be the most dangerous is actually stalking. Stalking behaviors are so common in young people today. It's really remarkable, and a lot of it has to do with the technology. Technology makes stalking so easy, and it's incredible how afraid and alone somebody feels when that is being used as a way to control them. And often they'll feel like nobody else can see it, so maybe it isn't real. It's crazy-making kind of behavior. So as I've mentioned, the desire to date, to have a dating partner, somebody that you get close to, is really developmentally appropriate. It's about our kids learning to pull away from the family and see themselves through the eyes of another person. And we get to know who we are through relationship, right? So it's not just about self-esteem. It is about how do we navigate the world and how do we connect or not connect with other people. And it is those connections that we form that really forms our identity. So teen dating is really an important part developmentally of any child's life. Some kids are going to be way out in front on that spectrum, and some kids are going to be a little more delayed. And it doesn't mean that anything's right or wrong with your child, it just means that's where they're at. And even in a developmentally appropriate kind of early relationship, it still does require parent involvement, but it's really how do we navigate that in a way that is helpful to our kids versus, too much interference, which, by the way, will just breed mistrust of you. Not of their peers, but of you. So if you're interfering too much early on, they're going to say, they don't trust me, so I'm always going to have to keep this a secret and keep it away from you, which none of us really want. So as middle school parents in particular, this is a great time because they're still willing to talk to you in middle school. Sometimes not as much as we want them to because it's so different from when they were littler, but they're still willing to talk to you as a middle school parent. When you get into high school, they're really going to not want to talk to you. So their influence is about what makes a good relationship or not good relationship. That number one influence is their peers. Number one. And there's another thing that happens with young people in dating. around peers. So they have that first serious boyfriend or girlfriend, and they become known as a couple for the first time. And how their peers perceive them as a couple is very, very important to them. It's much more important to them than how you perceive them as a couple. Their peers are what's the most important thing. But why that can lead to some dangerous things for your kiddo is if they decide this relationship isn't good for them anymore, but they're getting all this validation from other people about how great they are together as a couple, they may stay in that relationship. And it may not be healthy for them. It may not be good for them. So helping your kids to understand, again, learning to trust their gut, learning to pay attention to what feels right and what doesn't feel right. And if you decide to break up with someone and your friends give you a hard time about it, it's not your friend's decision. It's your decision because they don't know what's going on. And at the end of the day, you have to understand what your limits and boundaries are. Media. If we leave the media to do the educating of our kids around what relationships look like, every relationship they're ever going to have is a disaster. It's unbelievable to me when we talk about the differences between what it looks like today for them versus what it looked like for us. One of the biggest differences is the number of TV shows that are targeting kids directly and depicting relationships that are incredibly unhealthy and very often violent. So if they're taking their cues from what they see, in television and movies and the internet, they're really getting distorted messages. Young people in general have a very romantic notion of what love is. Okay? It's just inherent in our culture. It starts from tiny, tiny, tiny. Even if you haven't instilled kind of traditional gender roles in your kids, that notion of romance and, who's responsible for what, and love is just, you're all heady and up here all the time, it's just not true. And that idea that somebody who really loves you is going to fight for you, it's not true and it's not safe. And so if those are the dynamics they're creating to try to emulate what they're seeing, they could really be in that category of abusive or violent relationship, and they think they're doing it right. Okay? So the media influences, and there is really your greatest opportunity to have conversations with your kids about healthy and unhealthy relationships without being like, we need to sit down and talk, which, then they never want to talk, right? So, but if you're watching something together with them, you go to a movie, you're watching something on TV, and you see something that is just concerning to you, that is not healthy, there's a great opportunity to say, hey, what'd you think of that? What was that about? I didn't quite catch all that. Did you see what happened? And see if they can tell you about it. And see if you can figure out how they feel about what they just saw. Because those are cues. Those are going to be important cues for you about how your kids are interpreting what relationships need to look like. And then it gives you an opportunity to open their mind to another possibility if you're concerned about the direction that they're going in. But we got to be a little creative about where are there opportunities for us to open the door to these conversations, because if we try to do the big sit down, it's not going to work. It's going to be you talking, you're not going to get anything back, and they're not going to listen after about 5 or 6 minutes. They're just going to completely tune out. Our actions as parents speak volumes. Volumes. And so our kids, whether they like to admit it or not, learn more from how we engage together as parents than in any other relationship that they witness. So thinking about that, there's a lot of different styles of families today. There is no explicit right and wrong kind of family. But when you think about how you engage with your partner, whether you're still together, whether you're divorced, whether you're a blended family, really need to think about what kind of example you're setting. So if you have a relationship where you are able to disagree, it's important that your kids also see you then figure out how to negotiate back to a place of neutral. Right? So it's okay for your kids to see you argue, but they have to also then see you resolve. That's important for them because arguments and disagreements are just part of life. We often think we can't let our kids see us fight. You know, fight being a loose term. Clearly, we don't want anybody to be witnessing violence, but arguments and disagreements, seeing that is normal, and it's important for our kids actually to see that. Seeing us be respectful to one another is really, really important. Dads, for your girls, how many dads have girls? Okay, great. Most of the dads in the room have girls. Can any of you think of one way that you can model healthy dating relationships for your daughter in a way that they're not going to freak out? How you treat your wife. Yeah, that's one for sure. But that's a subtle one. She said, how you treat your wife, which is number one, super important. So dads, it's okay for you to take your daughters on a date. Maybe you don't call it that, but maybe you try to find a way to go to a movie together or go to dinner. And you treat her the way you want other people to treat her. Now, I'm not saying you have to open car doors and be all this chivalry and yada yada, but your experience and her time spent with you sends a message to her on how she should be treated by other people. It's a simple little thing, and it gets you some quality time together. And it shows her you're modeling for her how she should expect to be treated. And it's okay to say at the end of the night, you know, I really enjoyed spending time with you, and I hope whoever you choose to spend time with in the future treats you just like I did. Just a little exclamation point. Yeah. Your wife takes your son on dates. That's good too. It's great. Absolutely. So let's talk about boys for a minute. What do you think boys' challenges are in this world of dating? I see some eyes rolling. Right. So the rules have really changed in some ways, again, from when we were kids. You know, I think when we were younger, boys were always expected to be the pursuers. Right? That was the role, that was the definition of the role. And today, a lot more girls are pursuing, and that's not right or wrong, it just is. But boys don't always know what to do about that. They don't know how to handle that. Especially if maybe what they've been told is that it's their job to pursue. So, you know, just having conversations about what our roles, and really, again, it just comes back to that idea of respect. Be respectful of one another. You don't always have to say yes. If you're not interested in somebody, just be respectful. And that just goes a really, really long way, and it's remarkable how many kids don't get that message. That they think if they're being pursued and they don't want to be pursued by that person, that they get to be nasty and cruel about it. That's not going to be okay. And it just sets them up down the road. So our suggestions, so the dating one is a suggestion. We can talk with them about how we want them to be treated and how we want them to treat others, and that's important. But that's going to be the hardest one. The longer and the older they get, the less and less likely they are going to be willing to listen to your suggestions. And there's a reason it's number 4 on the list, because that's also the least important suggestion to them, you know, in these high school and junior high school years. They do matter, but they're for your kids toward the bottom of the list. So our actions at the end of the day speak louder than words. We talked about all of the ways, what are we modeling for our kids? And this is just really, really important. I don't know how many of you in here, you know, we've all got this presidential election going on right now. It's one of the most difficult elections I think we've ever had. It's the most difficult one I ever remember. And in my house, my husband and I are in very different places on the selection. And so we've had more verbal conflict around the candidates and the issues and discussions than we've ever had before. My daughter is 10. She cannot stand it when we're debating. She gets all freaked out about it. She gets very, very upset. And she goes to her room, and we have to go up and get her and say, it's okay, we just disagree, and we're trying to understand each other's viewpoints, and we get a little agitated, but we're okay, we still love one another, everything is fine. So, we can not talk. We can choose not to have the conversation at all because we know that it's upsetting to her. But that doesn't serve her either, because then it tells her that when she's upset about something, she just needs to keep it inside. Right? So it's better, even though momentarily she's uncomfortable, for us to have the conversation, to see it be resolved, to have us go to her and say, everything is going to be okay. You can disagree and still love one another. Right? Dads and moms, as I said, are equally important. They really are, to both their boys and girls, but dads in particular. Now, I need to preface this for a moment. I think one of the other things that's different about today versus when we were younger is that there is a whole lot more generalized acceptance among youth about students who are LGBTQ. And I don't want to get into a whole huge discussion about that, but I think that that is a beautiful thing for our kids. Their tolerance of one another, their acceptance of each other being who they are, does ease some of the pressure that people of our generation may have felt if they didn't conform. So regardless of who your child, what your child's sexual orientation is, both parents play a role. So if your daughter is heterosexual, dads are really, really important. It is important how you relate to your daughter, and it's important how you model how other people relate to her. But girls in particular really look to their fathers, even more so than their mothers, to know that they are okay as women, as young women. So, the side-eye look, geez, that's not quite good enough stuff, that lands on your daughter's dads. It lands in a big way. And so what happens for girls is then they go looking for men in their lives who are going to model what you modeled. They don't necessarily look for someone who's going to treat them better. They look for what's familiar. Okay? So dads, your role in your daughter's lives is very, very important. And how you engage with them and support them and promote them and help them really develop great self-esteem is what's going to lead them to pick a partner who's going to do the same thing for them. Okay? Boys look to their dads for that same stuff. It's interesting, that dad dynamic. What boys believe about themselves is largely formed by what their fathers believe about them. So just keep that in mind. Creating safe space, keeping that door of communication open. Finding creative ways to have conversations, as we talked about earlier. And for us as parents to just find ways to understand what they're thinking. So instead of us always talking at them, finding opportunities to let them talk to us. And one of the things we know about young people is they're really reluctant to come to us with problems. Big problems. Little problems, they come to us all day. Fix this mop, blah, blah, blah. But the big stuff, they wrestle with it. And they're afraid. So what they may do is come to you and say, my friend Susie's got this thing going on. Those are really, really, really important conversations if you didn't know that. This isn't just about Susie. It's probably them coming to you with something that's going on for themselves, but it's easier for them to pretend it's their friend. So you can also use that same tactic with them. If you're concerned about something or concerned about a group of friends or concerned about a dating partner, asking questions about, hey, I noticed such and such with so-and-so. What do you think about that? They'll talk about other people all day, but it gives you insight into how their minds are working and what they're thinking and what they're beginning to understand about relationships. So we have to get a little creative about that stuff. And then the last thing as parents that is really important, and this is a harder one to think about, we could have spent an hour just talking about this, is how do we not cast our own shadows forward on our kids when they start dating? So if dating for us was a hard experience or painful experience, or we always felt like we were the wallflower, and we look at our children and we think they're just the opposite of what I ever was, and I'm so grateful because their experience is going to be so much better than mine. That's well intended, but it's about you. It's not about them. This one's a particularly important one for me, and so I mentioned I would share elements of my own experience, but here's an example. I met the man who I would end up marrying when I was a junior in high school. And my mother was a wallflower. She describes herself as a wallflower when she was a kid. And she loved him. She absolutely adored him. And when she saw us together, she didn't see the stuff that he was doing that was making me feel afraid and scared, and there was a lot of it. But what she saw was how protective he was of me. And I remember her saying to me, Tom is so good for you because he will never let anything bad happen to you. That was her shadow being cast forward on me. And I was so afraid to disappoint her that I couldn't tell her how afraid of him I was. And that over time manifested in me literally following through and marrying him because I didn't want to disappoint her. Okay? So we can cast those shadows forward even from the best intentions. But we need to let our kids have their own experience and just be present to them. So learn to check yourself. What is it about this relationship that I do or do not like? And how do I stay neutral as a parent and not involve myself in it? It's hard. It's hard, but we really need to be able to just see our kids where they are at and not impose some of our own histories on them. Does that make sense? Okay. There's lots and lots of examples of how that can play out. So, as much as, parents' role in a child's life was number 4 on the list, and your opinions and your ideas, at the end of the day, they really do want to please you. So it gets in there. It gets in there and it swims around. But, they're not going to give you credit for it right up front. So dating is absolutely different today than it was when we were kids. The norm today is group dating. So generally, young people are not going to have somebody come over and pick one person up and go out on a date. It's going to be a group thing. The whole group's going out together. It's going to be a group of kids that you know, but at the end of the night, those kids pair up. That's very much what contemporary dating kind of looks like. And they're not going to tell you that that's how it works, but you need to know that that's how it works. Another piece about dating, particularly the really early dating, the stuff that's starting to happen in middle school, is this virtual, what I call virtual dating. So they're dating by text. They probably don't even talk to one another face to face, even at school. But they look at one another. They text, right? So these relationships, they're just different. I mean, when we were in 7th and 8th grade and we were beginning to experiment with this stuff, we were on the phone, right? We could talk on the phone for hours and hours and hours and hours. They don't even talk anymore. It's all with their thumbs, right? Or with social media, or they're Snapchatting. They're sending each other hundreds of pictures a day, and that's how they're communicating with one another and showing that they like one another, demonstrating affection. It's just a very, very different experience. But for you as parents, that makes it a little bit harder. At least when we were kids, our parents could hear us on the phone. They could hear one side of the conversation and figure out whether or not it was okay. Or, I remember getting the phone call and my father answering. Oh, God, that was the most embarrassing thing in the world when a boy would call for me and Dad would answer, because I had to deal with that. But we're out of that loop now, largely. And the social media stuff, particularly as they get older and your kids get more and more involved in all of the different social media platforms, that really does become a game changer. One of the first things that kids do when they really like somebody is give them their passwords. It's one of the very first things that they will do. That's how much I like you. I'm going to give you keys to my social media kingdom. It's bizarre to me as an adult that that's one of the things they do to show that they like one another. But it is. It's one of the first things they do. So talking with your kids about keeping their passwords and all that stuff to themselves is really important. And it may seem just absolutely basic, but it's really, really important. A lot of what we see as far as pictures getting stolen and unfairly distributed and blasted out to people happens when somebody else is in their account, right? So the social media stuff is absolutely a game changer. It not only changes how they relate to one another, they get in fights instead of trying to have a communication, arguing about the politics or whatever is upsetting them today. They're doing it over social media, and they're doing it so that all their friends can chime in, right? It is just a different experience. That what then is left for intimacy and learning about intimacy, all that's left then is really the sexual engagement, which is why kids are really pushing that boundary early and early and earlier, which is scary. But that learning how to relate to one another stuff is happening in a totally different way. So they don't have the same anxiety that we had as, am I going to go up and talk to this person right now? Are they going to rebuke me if I try to go up and talk to them? They might send a text and maybe they won't reply. Okay, they're not interested. So at some level, that's a little bit easier than it was for us, right? But it's just a different relational experience for kids. And so understanding how your kids communicate with their friends, what they're doing, the extent to which you're monitoring their activity in a healthy way is important. When you do find out that they're in a relationship with somebody or consider themselves in a relationship with somebody, you really do need to get to know that person. And trying to find opportunities to connect or see them doing what they like to do, finding out as much as you can about them, if you can, getting to meet their family. It's the values in the other person that are important. Okay? They may be very, very different from you, but if their values are fundamentally the same, chances are your kiddo is going to be all right with them because they have a fairly similar value system. What you want to watch for to know whether or not a relationship is healthy or unhealthy is, how does your son or daughter react after they've interacted with this person that they're in a relationship with? So maybe you're driving to Wegmans and they're texting, and when they finish texting, they don't tell you what goes on, but you kind of see their body language. You see them slump, you see them put their phone down, maybe you see them wipe their eye, look out the window, become kind of despondent. If that's their dating partner, pay attention. Because it's hard for them to tell you that something isn't right there, but something may not be right. It may be a moment, it may just be one little thing that they're disagreeing about, but if you see that repeatedly, you really do need to pay attention to it. And language, the language that young people use is so important. So, some key phrases that are indicative of a relationship that is abusive, if not already crossing the boundary into violent, is when young people talk about somebody needing them. He or she needs me, but they just need me. They're not going to say that to you. They're going to say that to their friends. You're going to see that on a post somewhere on social media. Oh, but they need me. How many people recall the Alexandra Kogut case at SUNY Brockport a couple years ago? So Alexandra was a incoming freshman at SUNY Brockport who was murdered by her boyfriend. Her last social media post before he killed her was, "I should have known." That was her last tweet. And when you go back and you look at the string of tweets and other social media posts that she made, there was all kinds of red flags about her anxiety about him coming to visit her on campus. She was trying to make this relationship work, but it was not a good relationship. So, the extent to which you're monitoring how your kids are communicating on social media will give you some big cues about how healthy these relationships are. So when somebody needs me, or, oh, they're so great except for this one thing and I can fix that. I don't think a girl particularly can utter any more scarier words about a dating partner than "I can fix him" or "I can fix her." Those are really, really distorted thoughts about relationships. We cannot fix anyone. And that can be a really serious hook for some kids. They feel like they're so great except for this one thing, which I can fix. So listen for that kind of language. Or beginning to rationalize or justify behavior that's unacceptable. Well, they didn't mean it. Oh, he just does that, but he doesn't mean it. Or she's like that, but she doesn't really mean it. It's really worth exploring that a little bit. Well, they didn't mean it. How often, has that happened before? How do you know they didn't mean it? What do you think they meant? That rationalization, it's so easy. And what I'm about to say is going to sound frightening, but it's really important that you know this. One thing we know through research is that young people do not have a clue about how dangerous their situations are when they are in the middle of them. They really don't. They minimize it. This was more of a college story, but to give you an example, there was a study done just recently out of the University of Virginia, and they surveyed several thousand college students. One of the students reported that she watched another student take a brick and put it through the windshield of their friend's car. Now, again, this peer dynamic, all of these kids were friends. So the one who put the brick through the window was also a friend of the witness. But it didn't register with the witness how dangerous this situation was. He was just really mad. He didn't mean it. He didn't mean it. He put a brick through the window of his girlfriend's car. They don't understand how dangerous these situations can be. So it is important, and they're not going to want to hear it from us when we say, well, what do you mean he didn't mean it? What happened? What happened? Not a, oh my God, what happened? But tell me about it. And then finding a way to say, look, that's really not acceptable behavior. That's really dangerous behavior. The other thing that young people will not do is they won't narc on one another, right? That's not all that different from when we were younger, but they don't want to blow somebody else in. And because kids tend to group more than we did, like once we would start dating, we were kind of a couple, and then we had our friends, but we were a couple too. That notion of groups of people today is different than when we were younger. And so they really are afraid of what happens to our group. What happens to our group if I say, you can't do that anymore? Or you scare me when you do that to her? or it doesn't make me feel good when you talk to him that way. I don't like it when you hit him. They're afraid of what's going to happen to their social circle if they start calling each other out on their behavior. So, the earlier we start having conversations with our kids about what is acceptable and what is unacceptable behavior, the more comfortable they'll be saying to their friend, knock it off. That's not okay. Another form of control that seems somewhat ambiguous, but when it's happening all the time can be a problem, is when one person in the relationship is making all the decisions. So, one person decides where they go every night, who they're hanging out with, what the other person's wearing. Those are all clues. Those are things to really pay attention to and ask your child about it. How does it feel when somebody else is making all the decisions all the time? Oh, I like it. It's easier. Really? You always used to wear this top, and I know you used to feel really good about yourself in it. Yeah, but they don't like it. Okay. Pay attention. Those are controlling tendencies that can be problematic. The other thing is if you're hearing language from your child that's starting to make alarm bells go off, listen to how your kids' friends talk about this relationship, because they will tell you about this relationship in terms that maybe your child won't tell you. So, and if you do become concerned about your child's relationship, here's the hard part. You need to be gentle and firm, but if you start issuing ultimatums, your child is going to run to that abuser, and they're going to protect them because they think they know what's right for them, and you don't, and they don't want you to interfere. Okay? So if you start to just try to impose and be the parent, to take back the control that you're so afraid of losing, and say, oh, no, 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 you're going to do it my way, then they're going to start sneaking. They're going to start sneaking around and still seeing this person, which is more dangerous because then you don't know at all what's going on. Okay, so you got to be gentle but firm. If you actually see evidence or experience, something that you actually see, there may be times when you actually have to make a hard line. You may even have to engage law enforcement. In New York State, you can get orders of protection for your children from a dating partner, if it comes to that. We can do that in New York State. There are some states where that's not possible, but you can get help if things really, really get out of control. And in those cases, you have to trust your gut. It's not then about them trusting their gut anymore. It's about you stepping in and doing what has to be done. The statistics are also really startling about even when things are really, really scary, kids don't tell you. They're going to keep it a secret. They're going to think they can handle it. And I will give you one other example of my own story in that. So I had been with my boyfriend junior year and senior year. A whole lot of water under that bridge by that time in just a year, and I decided I wanted to break up with him. And I attempted to break up with him. He was very upset, and he said he needed a minute. So I left him in my room, and I went out and sat in my living room for a few minutes, and like half an hour went by, and he didn't come out. And I went looking for him, and my mother was not home, and I found him hanging in my closet. It was probably just a manipulation, but I was 17, and I didn't know that it was a manipulation. All I knew was that it looked to me like he tried to commit suicide. This is a very common tactic with young people. They know better than to become violent at times with their other partner, but what a controlling way to say, if you leave me, I will die. I never told anyone. I was too afraid. I felt too responsible that I didn't tell my mother that when I tried to break up with him, he tried to kill himself. And the second time I tried to break up with him, about 6 months later, the same thing happened. And at that point, My story was, I can never get away because it will never be okay with me for him to die because of me. I didn't understand that he was making the choices that he was making and that it wasn't about me, that I was not responsible for him. And that's kind of how that young mind works. We feel like the whole world is available to us and we can do anything and be anything, and that's wonderful. But what we can never do or be is be responsible for another human being until we're a parent. Then we're responsible for another human being. Right? But in an intimate relationship or partnership, you're never responsible for that other person's happiness. You're not responsible for whether or not they live or die. And as a teenager, that is exactly how I felt. Okay, so knowing that kids keep this violence a secret is important. Knowing that your kids have other adults in their life that are safe adults that they might go to if they're too afraid to come to you, that's important. If you can foster those relationships for your kids, that gives them another opportunity to connect with someone when they're afraid or when it feels too big to handle and they don't want to come to you. So we'll go through just the kind of what is domestic violence or dating violence quickly, because it's already 5 after 8, so I started at 5 after 7, so I'll try to finish up in about 5 minutes. So the definition of dating violence is physical, sexual, psychological, or emotional violence within a dating relationship that also includes stalking. It can occur in person or electronically, and it might occur between a current or former dating partner. That's very important, particularly as your kids get older. In 2011, the CDC did a nationwide survey and found that 23% of females and 14% of males who had ever experienced rape or physical violence or stalking by an intimate partner, this was in adulthood, their very first experience with some form of intimate partner violence happened between the ages of 11 and 17. So this violence is really pervasive, and it starts at remarkably young ages. 1 in 5 tweens between the ages of 11 and 14 will tell you that they have a friend that they think is in a violent or abusive dating relationship. 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 5 boys in the 7th grade report being physically violent with a dating partner. And 1 in 10 high school students says that they have been hit, slapped, or physically hurt on purpose by a boyfriend or a girlfriend. Those of us who have students who are LGBTQ, those students are really at the greatest risk for violence in relationships. So while, the general population has an acceptance of sexual orientation that's different from when we were kids, there's still a lot of difficulty in those relationships early on. It's hard for kids. What is interesting about dating violence, which is different than domestic violence, and all parents need to pay attention to this, especially the parents of boys. Girls and boys are equally physically violent. So there is a myth that says that boys are the only ones that punch, hit, kick, slap, bite. It is absolutely not true. In people under the age of 18, it is almost equally perpetrated, that physical violence. The reality is that because during those years, boys grow bigger than girls most of the time, when a boy chooses to use physical violence, there are more significant consequences to the female, and therefore, boys get the rap for being physically violent. However, when girls are hitting, biting, punching, kicking boys, they are not unharmed. They may not have a physical consequence to that, but there is a profound emotional consequence to that. There is so much shame on a boy to come forward and say that I'm being hit by my girlfriend. They'll get laughed out of the locker room. They might even get mocked by their friends. They might get even mocked by you. Because we're so conditioned to teach boys to be tough. Right? Rub a dirt in it, take a lap. You know, you can't let a girl push you around. So, another reality about the dynamics of sexual violence that is different, that's similar to adulthood, is that when sexual violence is being perpetrated or people are being pressured into sexual acts, it is more often that the male is the aggressor in that situation. So we need to have very honest conversations with our kids about what's okay and what's not okay, boys or girls. You know, for generations, there's been a boys don't hit girls kind of message in polite society. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but it needs to be, we don't hit. We need to take the gender out of it. It just needs to be, we don't hit. We don't resolve conflict by hitting. So, girls are generally more emotionally mature, especially in junior high and high school. The majority of the abuse that girls perpetrate is with this. We can be brutal. And remember, we learn who we are and what our lives are about through relationship with others. So if you are attracted to or fond of or in love with, the way you understand love as a teenager, another person, a boy and a girl, and the girl just tears you down at every opportunity, you carry that into your next relationship. So the other thing we have to remember about these relationships is we're learning how to do it. And if we don't get it right early, chances are we continue to make those mistakes over and over and over and over again. So we're going to make some mistakes, but we want to be able to learn from them and move on and not have them be such big mistakes that it really damages our sense of self. So the consequences of this, really there's physical and emotional consequences that can last really for the rest of your life. Young people who are experiencing dating violence. Now, a lot of these behaviors that I'm going to mention now are just similar to if your child starts using drugs or other things. So it can be hard to sort out what's going on with your kid in this day and age and figuring out what's happening. But kids who experience dating violence are very likely to present as being depressed or anxious. They are probably going to engage in some unhealthy behaviors to try to reconcile those feelings of anxiety or depression. They may start smoking, using drugs or alcohol. They may start demonstrating some antisocial behaviors. And they also may have thoughts about or attempt suicide. Much higher rates of suicide among kids who have experienced domestic or dating violence than there is among kids who have not had that experience. Youth who are victims of dating violence in high school are at significantly higher likelihood of victimization in college. So colleges are getting the rap right now for not protecting their kids, but the reality is by the time the kids get there, many of them have already been in this pond. And the colleges are just left to deal with it. Young people ages 12 to 19, 12, experience the highest rates of sexual assault, starting at 12. There's just an intense amount of pressure on our kids to start engaging in sexual behaviors that we didn't really think seriously about until we were in high school, starting now. That's the media influence. That's our culture's influence. And young women between the ages of 16 and 24 are the most likely to be murdered by a dating partner. Those rates drop significantly again until the woman is in her 60s, actually, and then the rates go up again. But, the Alexander Kogut story, and there are numerous other ones that I could cite, there's just too many. And this notion that young men can't control their anger, they just snapped, that's really something that we have to start talking to people about, young boys and young girls both. We don't just snap, we make choices. And choosing to be in a healthy relationship is a choice. Choosing to be in an unhealthy relationship is a choice. So, okay, I did it. Looking at the time. I'm more than happy to take questions. I gave you a lot of handouts And those handouts go into a whole lot more detail about what dating and domestic violence can look like for your kids. You know, I would encourage you to think about whether or not that's something you want to share with them. The one that I actually like the most for kids is the Dating Bill of Rights is an awesome tool. When we talked about consent earlier, it's what am I responsible for and what do I have a right to? These are simple ideas, but they're really important. Yeah. Is my presentation on the website? No, but I can send it to Dorothy, and it's being videotaped. So, okay. So this is a really, really useful tool. This is good for any kind of relationship, whether it's a dating relationship or, you know, a friendship. What are my rights and responsibilities? On the back is what we call a power and control wheel. And a lot of times people don't know what is acceptable and unacceptable in a relationship. All of the examples on the back of this wheel, it's not 100% inclusive, but all of the examples on the back of this wheel are examples of behaviors that are not okay in a relationship. You don't have to be in multiple spokes of the wheel. You might be in one spoke, and it might have been one time, and it doesn't make it okay. That's part of our whole cultural conversation about this. One time can constitute an unhealthy or abusive relationship. And then the other one that is great is the dating abuse red flags. So this is good for you, and it's good for your young person to know about. And since young boys and girls both perpetrate violence, on the back of that is what it looks like when maybe you're the one perpetrating. Perpetrating is an ugly word. But when you're the one that's doing the abusing, okay? So things to look for and pay attention to. It's important to me to do this work because I would love to believe that if somebody had told me about this, one second, it would have changed the trajectory of my life forever. But I ended up marrying him and with him until I was 25. So literally the first 25 years of my life were, you know, absorbed by this issue, and today I'm okay, and I'm even in many ways grateful that I can share my experience and connect with other people and hopefully create spaces where others won't have to go through what I went through. But we can change this dynamic. It is possible, and it starts with parents. It doesn't just start with the kids. So thank you for being here. Mm-hmm. So, you know, moms are, the question was, you know, we talked a lot about what dads can do and what do moms need to do. You know, I think mom has to be able to hold kind of the emotional container for their young people. And moms probably have more opportunities to start the conversations about what they're seeing, observing, you know, being the watcher, if you will, and looking for opportunities to have conversations and communicate about this is good, this is not good. And sharing your opinions, and even maybe prefacing those as opinions. In my opinion, that's not great. What do you think about it? Right. So I think that moms have to be able to kind of hold that space for their kids. That's important. Is that helpful? Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, you know what's interesting to me? We're happy to come in and talk to students too. It's a different conversation with the kids. It's more about what it looks like, what's healthy, what's unhealthy. Usually health classes are the gateway for that. We've been successful with some other districts in joining in kind of the health curriculum. It's really funny to me that the health curriculum is kind of all about the plumbing. They tell them how to use the plumbing, but they don't help them understand the consequences of using the plumbing. So it's, yeah, it's great. I love to have the conversations directly with the kids. And when we do come in and talk to kids, we always come in as a male and female facilitator together, because I can tell you the number of times I've been in a room as the only instructor, and you can watch the boys especially kind of take their inventory. Do I do this? Do I do that? No. Okay, I'm good. And they're like, they just check out. But when I have a male co-facilitator, they stay tuned in the whole time. Kids are really curious about relationships. They really are. They want to know how to do it well. So they're willing to have the conversations. It's just, who are they willing to have them with? Yeah, they need some adult guidance in this realm. When they're only learning from each other, that's where things can get a little problematic.